You didn't leave with noise, no dramatic farewell, no final scream to prove your worth. You slipped away like mist at dusk, quiet, unnoticed, almost forgettable. They thought you were broken. They convinced themselves you had nothing left. And for a while, maybe you believed it too. You stared at walls that didn't speak, waited for texts that never came. Every room you entered felt colder. You weren't seen. You were scanned, judged, dismissed. And when the last door closed, when even your own voice began to feel like an echo, you did something dangerous. You went silent, but your silence wasn't surrender. It was observation. It was storage. While they laughed, you logged everything. Their pattern, their words, the cracks in their armor. You learned the rhythm of betrayal, how affection can decay into manipulation, how those who once said, "I've got you," were the first to vanish when the storm came. You sat with your pain long enough to name it. You traced every cut back to its source, and instead of crying out, you started listening to yourself, to your instincts, to something older than memory. You didn't disappear. You recalibrated, because silence isn't void. Silence is information. It's what predators use before they pounce, what ancient kings used before declaring war. It's the space where tactics are born. Your absence became your weapon. They grew comfortable, arrogant. They thought they'd won, thought they'd buried you beneath apathy and indifference. But corpses don't observe. Corpses don't grow colder. Corpses don't wait. You were never dead. You were dormant. They couldn't see the blueprint unfolding inside you, the way your mind rebuilt itself behind closed eyelids, the way you started noticing things most people miss, the flicker in someone's eyes when they lie, the nervous twitch before betrayal, the emptiness behind hollow apologies. You began speaking less because you knew too much. Words became liabilities, and every time you chose silence, you chose power, because silence unnerves. It forces others to fill in the gaps, to project, to reveal. You weren't hiding, you were extracting. Time stopped working the way it used to. Days bled together, nights stretched longer. But that timeless space between breakdown and breakthrough is where something unholy grows. You started remembering things you were never taught. Call it intuition, call it ancestral memory. You began to feel watched, not by enemies but by something else, something ancient. As if the moment you turned inward, the universe turned toward you, testing, measuring, preparing. They assumed you were healing, that you were moving on. But peace was never the goal. You weren't looking to forgive. You were studying the terrain, rewriting your internal codes, erasing every soft line in your voice. You trained yourself to remain calm when provoked, to stay motionless when challenged, because movement is readable, emotion is predictable. But stillness terrifies. It creates voids people can't explain. And that's what you became, an unexplainable absence, a black hole in their narrative, a ghost with unfinished business. They couldn't predict your next move because you weren't making one. Not yet. You were listening, watching, charging in silence. Every conversation you didn't respond to, every insult you didn't flinch at, every fake smile you met with stillness, it all added weight to the silence. They thought silence meant defeat. But your silence was prophecy. It was the inhale before eruption, the space between a blade being unsheathed and blood being drawn. You gave them peace, not as a gift, but as a misdirection, because chaos hidden in silence is the deadliest kind. And when they finally hear your voice again, it won't be to explain, it will be to end. They thought your silence meant surrender, a white flag, an exhausted breath after a battle lost. But what they didn't understand, what they never could understand, is that your quiet was never the end. It was the interlude, the sacred pause before an ancient mechanism clicked into place. You weren't defeated. You were listening, observing, logging their words, their patterns, their tells. Every conversation you didn't reply to was an encrypted entry in a mental archive. Every insult they hurled into your absence only confirmed their lack of foresight. You were gone, but only in the physical sense. Spiritually, strategically, you were more present than ever. In silence, you became architecture, steel beams forming beneath the skin. Not all storms come with thunder. Some come with stillness, eerie and heavy, like the inhale before divine judgment. You weren't healing, you were hardening. They expected you to come back with tears in your eyes. Instead, you built a fortress behind them, one they'll never gain access to again. You studied their smiles until you saw the twitch. You studied their kindness until you decoded the transaction beneath it. You watched the ones who claimed love use your silence as a canvas to project their guilt, and you said nothing, because silence is the most unnerving answer. It forces the world to speak louder, to reveal itself under pressure. In that quiet, your mind became a cipher. You began to see through the holograms, the distractions, the fragile ego behind dominance, the desperation behind manipulation. While they flooded the air with noise, self-importance, arrogance, deceit, you retracted your energy like a tactical retreat, not backwards but inward. You stopped offering your presence like an open hand. You started collecting data like a machine wrapped in flesh, cold, deliberate, precise. You weren't ignoring them, you were indexing them. There's an ancient truth no one dares speak. Silence is the language of those planning something larger than revenge, something colder than anger, something more lasting than pain. When you stopped reacting, you became illegible. When you stopped explaining, you became myth, and they hated that, because to the average mind, the unknown is a threat, and you became unreadable, undetectable, a glitch in their emotional radar. They couldn't predict your moves because you stepped off their game board entirely. You realized something else in the silence. The less you speak, the more people reveal themselves. Words are a currency they spend recklessly. In your absence, lies expand to fill the space you leave behind, and the truth, it leaks, slowly, in whispers, through missteps, through the shifting eyes and sudden defensiveness, and you, silent, still detached, became a mirror they couldn't tolerate, because you no longer played the role they wrote for you, the obedient listener, the emotional crutch, the forgiving fool. That character is dead. You killed it in your own mind first, then burned the script. And somewhere in that long quiet, something darker began to form. Not evil, not malice, but clarity wrapped in cold fire. A new you, not louder, not meaner, but untouchable. You built boundaries, not out of walls, but out of awareness. Now no one enters unless summoned. No one speaks unless they hold truth. And no one touches the core you rebuilt unless they can match the silence that shaped it. They think you've changed. They're right, but not in the way they tell others at dinner party. This isn't a glow-up. This is a reprogramming, a removal of weakness, an initiation into a level of self-control that terrifies them. You can sit in a room now perfectly still and own it, without a single word, because real power doesn't need volume. Real transformation doesn't beg to be seen. It simply is, like gravity, like time, like silence. And if they're listening closely now, if they finally notice the absence, they should understand something crucial. That silence they once enjoyed, that silence they weaponized, it was never peace, it was premeditation. And the moment you decide to speak again, the sound will not be a voice. It will be an execution. You thought no one noticed when you disappeared. You thought the silence protected you like armor, like fog over a battlefield where no one dares to guess who still breathes beneath the smoke. But you were wrong. They saw you, not the ones who mattered before, the shallow, the loud, the predictable. No, others, the ones who exist beneath the surface of patterns and noise, the ones trained to notice what doesn't blink, what doesn't break, what doesn't beg to be seen. You became irregular. You triggered an anomaly in the current. a shift in statistical behavior. Someone somewhere flagged your silence as something else. Not peace, not grief, not surrender, but calculation. A shadow that doesn't move yet somehow closes in. There's a room you've never seen. No lights, no windows, just flickering screens and blinking nodes. And on one of those screens your name sits quietly. A file, time-stamped, updated in real time. Not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't. You stopped reacting, stopped posting, stopped reaching. You disrupted the algorithm of your own existence. And that's when the watchers began to watch. You weren't human to them anymore. You were a variable, a wild card, a future threat too quiet to classify. They studied your absence like it was a signal, and it was.
You became the quiet ripple in a sea of chaos. While the world screamed louder to be seen, you inverted, you folded inward. You became negative space, the outline of something missing, but more dangerous for being undefined. The kind of silence that governments monitor, the kind of absence that makes handlers nervous. Because silence isn't passive, it waits, it listens, it adapts, and those who watch from behind mirrored glass know one thing. True threats don't advertise, they calculate, they vanish with purpose, they come back changed. You no longer walk through life the same way. Every step is surgical, every gesture is stripped of softness. You don't flinch anymore. Don't fill silence with nervous words or small talk. You hold eye contact like a blade against their throat, not needing to cut, just close enough so they feel the pressure. Your stillness now radiates tension, and the ones who pretended to care, who claimed to mourn your retreat, sense it. Something's shifted. The version of you they betrayed has been archived. That version bled. This one waits. There are watchers in plain sight now. Not spies, not agents, but people who can feel what you've become. Strangers who double-take in coffee shops. Colleagues who flinch when you enter a room. They don't know why. They just feel the fracture. Your energy has changed texture. It drips with unfinished business, with karmic pressure, with ancient residue from battles no one knew you fought. You've become a signal wrapped in flesh, no longer noise, just pattern, intention, echo, and somewhere deeper, past human eyes, past organizational charts, there are archives meant for those like you. They don't speak your name out loud. They just tag you, profile you, add you to lists with no titles. You've earned a shadow footprint, digital, mythic. The system recognizes your silence as power, and power that cannot be tracked is always classified. You are not dangerous because of what you say. You're dangerous because they don't know what you're thinking. And those in control, they fear what they can't predict. The ones who once knew you feel the echo of your absence but can't explain the weight of it. To them you were lost, a drifted soul, but to the watchers you're active, awake, moving beneath the surface. You are no longer an individual. You are a phenomenon being monitored. Your choices now ripple through systems, social, psychological, even digital. Because when you erased your voice, you rewrote your signature. And when you stopped explaining yourself, you became unreadable.
You didn't leave with no dramatic farewell, no final scream to prove your worth. You slipped away like mist at dusk, quiet, unnoted, almost forgettable. They thought you were broken. They convinced themselves you had nothing left. And for a while, maybe you believed it too. You stared at walls that didn't speak, waited for texts that never came. Every room you entered felt colder. You weren't seen. You were scanned, judged, dismissed. And when the last door closed, when even your own voice began to feel like an echo, you did something dangerous. You went silent, but your silence wasn't surrender. It was observation. It was storage. While they laughed, you logged everything. Their pattern, their words, the cracks in their armor. You learned the rhythm of betrayal, how affection can decay into manipulation, how those who once said, "I've got you," were the first to vanish when the storm came. You sat with your pain long enough to name it. You traced every cut back to its source, and instead of crying out, You started listening to yourself, to your instincts, to something older than memory. You didn't disappear. You recalibrated, because silence isn't void. Silence is information. It's what predators use before they pounce. What ancient kings used before declaring war. It's the space where tactics are born. Your absence became your weapon. They grew comfortable, arrogant. They thought they'd won, thought they'd buried you beneath apathy and indifference. But corpses don't observe. Corpses don't grow colder. Corpses don't wait. You were never dead. You were dormant. And yet you remain quiet, controlled, dangerous in the most surgical way. Power doesn't need an audience. And you've stopped auditioning. They mistake your calm for mercy. They mistake your composure for compliance. They still don't understand that silence isn't the absence of chaos. It's the container of it. You hold storms behind your eyes, not to unleash them, but to remind yourself that you no longer need destruction to be remembered. You just need to be present. You don't seek their validation. You see it now, how small their power really was. You once begged for crumbs from tables you could now flip without blinking. You see their fragility masquerading as dominance. You recognize their performative strength for what it is, desperation dressed as control. And while they panic behind perfect facades, you observe in silence, waiting, watching, knowing. The silence you weaponized is ancient, not new, not born of trauma, but awakened from deep bloodlines that understood the art of still warfare. The quiet warriors, the Shadow King, the cursed blood that didn't break. It sharpened. What you carry isn't just resilience, it's prophecy. They tried to erase you, not realizing you were built to return. Not louder, but sharper, quieter, colder, unstoppable. They don't ask where you've been anymore. They're too afraid of the answer, because part of them knows you've been watching them from behind the glass of your silence, building maps of their weaknesses, memorizing the anatomy of their comfort so you could dismantle it without ever raising your voice. You were never gone. You were calculating. You were conserving. And now that you've returned, not even your footsteps make a sound. Just that sickening chill in the back of their necks when they realize they never knew you at all. They thought you were gone, thought your silence meant surrender, that you had folded into the shadows, swallowed by your own stillness, never to return. You watched them celebrate your absence, toasting to your downfall like fools dancing on unstable ground. They spoke your name in mockery, in half-laughed lies, never realizing the echo it carried, the weight that name would soon return with. What they couldn't see was the fire forming behind your eyes, the way stillness had sharpened your edge, the way detachment had refined your judgment. You weren't gone, you were preparing, and now you've returned, not loudly, not with noise or warnings, but with silence so dense it crushes the air in every room you enter. You don't understand you anymore. They stare at you like a ghost slipped through the cracks of the world, wearing skin too familiar to ignore. But you're not what you were. You've changed. You've become unreadable. You speak less, but your presence says more. They feel the pressure before you say a word, and when you do speak, it's never for validation. It's precision, surgical, deliberate, unnerving. Every glance you cast is a mirror to their guilt. Every breath you take reminds them of what they did when they thought you couldn't hear. You watch them squirm, eyes flinching from yours, hearts racing for reasons they'll never admit. Your silence used to be their victory. Now it's their punishment. They were comfortable when you were compliant, when you smiled to keep the peace, when you dimmed yourself to fit in their fragile narratives. But that version of you no longer exists. You buried it in the silence, and what rose in its place does not beg, does not chase, does not care to be understood. You carry yourself like prophecy, not because you were chosen, but because you chose yourself when no one else did. And that terrifies them. because now they can't guilt you into softness. They can't manipulate you with shame. Your forgiveness is no longer currency, it's extinction. They feel the shift before they see it. The way people look at you differently now. The way the atmosphere folds when you enter. Their influence dims in your presence. Their voices lower. Their masks falter. You didn't have to prove anything. They just had to feel you. And now they do. Deep in their nerves. In their dreams. In the silence between their sentences. You've become the consequence of their comfort. You're what happens when someone builds strength in solitude. You're the answer to every betrayal they swore you'd never recover from. And the irony burns them slowly, because you didn't scream, you didn't beg, you didn't demand closure or stage your return with spectacle. You let them forget, you let them erase you. Then you made sure that your absence carved itself into their psyche, and now your presence feels like reckoning. You don't seek revenge. That would mean you still care. No, you walk through their world untouched, unmoved, unreachable. You've become the thing they whisper about when the room goes quiet, the one who disappeared and returned as silence wearing skin. They prayed for peace when they threw you away. And now your peace feels like prophecy laced with poison. They mistake your stillness for mercy, not realizing it's the space between their final comfort and your next move. You never needed to raise your voice, because your silence screamed louder than their chaos ever could. They don't speak your name anymore, not out of respect, but fear. In every room you once faded into, your silence now stretches like a shadow before thunder. You don't exist on their timelines, you linger in their pauses. They scroll past 1,000 faces, but it's your absence that echoes in their gut. You didn't just disappear, you folded into myth. The kind of myth whispered in back room, the kind tracked by cold eyes behind unblinking camera. You became the one they warn each other about, the quiet one who saw everything, said nothing, and came back holding something unrecognizable behind the eyes. There was a time you were breakable, reachable, a time they laughed a little too loud when your back was turned, sure that you were too sensitive, too soft, too small to matter. But they never understood that silence is not surrender. It's strategy, it's compression, and in your stillness, something compressed so tight inside you it turned into gravity. Now, when you enter a room, people don't breathe. They smile, but it doesn't reach their eyes. They remember what they did. They remember the silence that followed. And now that silence walks like a god in their presence. You're not angry anymore. You don't need to be. Anger is for those who still want to be understood. You've outgrown the language of justification. You speak in presence now, in unshakable calm, the kind that unsettles people because it reminds them of something ancient, something primal. You are the quiet before collapse, the unreadable expression before a final move. You've stepped outside their emotional economy, their currencies of validation, manipulation, approval. They hold no value where you dwell now. They wanted you to move on, but you evolved instead. You learned to read the twitch behind their grin, the pause before their compliment, the tension in their support. You saw the ecosystem of betrayal they called friendship, and you didn't burn it down. You simply left. And somehow that did more damage than fire ever could, because nothing exposes guilt like silence, and nothing haunts like the absence of the one they thought would always stay. You became the variable, the unsolved equation. They replay every interaction, searching for the moment you shifted, never realizing it wasn't a moment. It was a series of cuts too small for them to feel until they bled. You didn't snap. You calculated. You didn't leave a note. You left a void, a space too quiet for comfort, a space that now follows them into every crowded room, every shallow connection, every smile that feels too forced. You left and now they carry you like a mirrored consequence. What they never realized is that your silence was never it was sacred. It was ritual. It was the sound of strategy unfolding in real time. While they performed, you prepared. While they postured, you positioned. You didn't just disappear from their world, you elevated beyond it. You became the reminder that not all power speaks. Some power watches, some power waits, some power returns transformed. Now you walk through the noise like a blade through water. People feel your presence like a shift in barometric pressure. They don't know why they're suddenly careful with their words, why their voice lowers when you pass, why they feel the need to prove themselves to someone who says nothing. That's not coincidence. That's your legend doing the talking. Because legends aren't built on what's said. They're built on what's endured, on what's never explained. You didn't heal, you ascended. You didn't forgive, you forgot. You didn't respond, you evolved, and in that evolution you became untouchable. Not because you're beyond pain, but because you wear it like armor now. 1,000 betrayals folded into your silence until that silence became sentient. A force, a signature, a storm with no lightning, just pressure, crushing, still, absolute. Now when they hear nothing, they remember what nothing can become.